The American Revolution was a bloody and brutal war. It was not just a colony's war for independence, but a future country's first civil war. A civil war where neighbors and families chose between the status quo. For some that meant economic and social stability. Others chose the chance of self-government, at political independence. Make no mistake, the American Revolution was a war of choosing sides. In this landscape, neutrality was not an option. While the political, economic, and social ideology of the patriots and loyalists may differ, their makeup came from a once unified colony of fellow citizens. The American Revolution tore apart communities, it divided the social landscape, and it ultimately left one side disenfranchised and disillusioned. This division was perhaps no more evident than on the community of Staten Island, caught between a stern loyalty to the crown and the deterioration of a once secure socioeconomic structure. Staten Islanders represented a community in an identity crisis. To understand Staten Island's experience during the American Revolution, we first must explore the island's strategic significance during the British invasion of New York City. Located at the southernmost point of New York State, Staten Island was selected as the first landing spot for General William Howe, then Commander-in-Chief of the British forces, in his siege against New York City. Through this film, I had the opportunity to sit with two prominent Revolutionary War historians and scholars, Barnet Schecter and Philip Pappas, to dissect Staten Island's role during the American Revolution, and to better understand the effects of the war on this small, agrarian community.
Even a brief glance at a map shows you that Staten Island really forms half of the gateway, as it were, to New York's Upper Bay. Between western Long Island and Staten Island runs the Narrows, and it's through that strait that an enemy force would have to proceed to reach the Upper Bay and ultimately to the prize of New York City. And so Staten Island is important strategically also because it's so close to the New Jersey shore, and Brooklyn and Manhattan. Really could be considered a kind of central point for launching attacks or fending them off from several directions, from a fleet coming in past Sandy Hook from the Atlantic or from the New Jersey coast. So it's really a key position, and somewhat baffling why the Americans failed to take advantage of it, to fortify it more vigorously before the arrival of the British in 1776.
Staten Island's proximity to New York City played a critical factor in Howe's selection of the island, but it represented just one of many advantages Howe gained by controlling this area. The island's diverse landscape of thick woodlands and expansive farmland represented a practical staging ground for Howe to house the eventual tens of thousands of British and Hessian troops that would call Staten Island home during the war.
Staten Island was, as far as the size of the island, geographically speaking, the island was about 13 miles long and 7 miles wide. It had various marshes, creeks breaking up the geography and the topography of the island. You had such as Richmond Creek, Main Creek, the main one being the Fresh Kills Creek, which runs about a mile from the Arthur Kill to the village of Richmond at the center of the island. And these creeks were used as outlets by farmers to navigate their produce to markets in New Jersey, such as Elizabethtown and Woodbridge and Perth Amboy, as well as Manhattan, New York City market.
Staten Island during the late 1700s was a small, predominantly middle-class agrarian community, with the slave population representing nearly 1/3 of the 3,000 island residents. Staten Island positioned itself as both uniquely secluded, due to its isolation by water, but firmly integrated into New York and New Jersey's bustling economy due to its centralized location. During the war, Staten Island would serve as a beacon for Loyalist activity, creating a natural friction in an otherwise Patriot-controlled New York City. But while the island's ultimate decision to support the Crown was at odds with their neighbors, the move was rooted in deep-held beliefs and the goal of self-preservation.
different factors involved in sort of why a person or a community would choose reconciliation over independence or vice versa. One of the major factors for Staten Island was economics. Staten Island was a middle-class farming community. The residents of the island were doing well economically speaking underneath the British Empire. It's a matter of, well, I'm doing well, financially, why rock the boat? Also, there's a sort of cultural, social factor. The Anglican faith was very strong here on Staten Island. Many of the political leaders in the community were of the Anglican Church, the Anglican Church being the Church of England, the Church of the Empire.
A cornerstone of the Anglican faith in Staten Island was the Church of St. Andrew. Originally built in 1712, the church is located in the heart of Richmond town and would later serve as a hospital for British troops during the Revolution.
There is this religious factor that plays into the decision to support reconciliation over independence. There's also the fact that, and I guess this ties back to economics, during the French and Indian War, Staten Islanders did well when the British military was here, selling their produce to the military. And then there's also the sort of factor of deference. Deference was very important in colonial America. The idea of sort of respecting those above you in the social ladder. Deference was very strong here in Staten Island. Many Staten Islanders sort of looked to those above them on the social ladder, like Christopher Billop, for example, who was a prominent political figure on Staten Island, prominent landowner. There were varying factors that came into play, from finances to cultural to social factors, that made Staten Islanders choose reconciliation over independence.
As the residents of Staten Island were deciding their loyalties, the British forces were evacuating Boston after a crushing blow to control the major port city. The British had been occupying Boston for several years, and their failure at the hands of the smaller and less experienced Continental Army would lead to a retaliatory force not seen before. General Howe, off his recent defeat, sailed to Halifax, Nova Scotia to regroup and refortify his army. It was here Howe planned his attack on the colony's second largest city, New York City. General Washington, commander of the Continental Army, feared New York City would be Howe's next target and began preparing fortifications for the impending attack. In these moments, a critical strategic mistake is made that would dramatically affect the outcome of the New York and New Jersey campaign. With a British invasion looming, Washington would appoint General Charles Lee to command the defenses and Continental forces in New York.
Washington's second in command, Major General Charles Lee, had fortified other parts of the New York theater of war, but really failed to address the potential of Staten Island as a defensive point, a choke point at the entrance to New York's waterways that could have been defended with entrenchments and forts and cannon and placed on the shore, defending the narrows at the opening to New York's upper bay. And floating batteries could have been deployed in the lower bay and at Sandy Hook to prevent the British from coming in the first place.
The British had few options for reaching New York City through the Atlantic. Geographically, Manhattan can be accessed through 3 points: the Arthur Kill, the East River, and the Narrows. As it happens, 2 of these points must pass directly alongside Staten Island, with the Narrows being the largest and most direct route to the heartbeat of New York City. While Lee left the island undefended, it was General Howe who would eventually capitalize on the island's strategic location for controlling New York City's waters.
In fact, in 1779, when the French fleet arrives under d'Estaing, 78, 79, the British are able to keep a French fleet from entering by lining up batteries just inside Sandy Hook. So that whole lower bay and that sort of southeastern flank of Long Island below, stretching from the Narrows on down, should have gotten a lot more attention when Lee was fortifying the area.
Staten Island's loyalism proved challenging for Washington to manage. As the British forces sailed closer to New York, Staten Island residents grew more resistant to continental presence.
It's sort of puzzling. You would think, well, why wouldn't he set up defenses on Staten Island and sort of fortify the Narrows?
The inherent challenge of Staten Island's willingness to undermine the Continental Army left General Lee with difficult strategic choices to make. But were those choices correct?
It goes back to he's got choices to make, because of his manpower shortage and his shortage of his equipment. Staten Island being a loyalist stronghold, being an island, could be easily taken by the British. Lee believes if I place troops on Staten Island and supplies and military equipment, chances are they're going to be captured.
The residents of Staten Island made life difficult for the Continental forces stationed there. While Washington and Lee were attempting to defend New York City, Staten Island refused to accept such a reality. With Staten Island posing such an obstacle to General Lee's strategic goals, the discussion was had on how to best handle the residents of the island.
He did have a suggestion for how to control Staten Islanders. He suggested that the New York Patriots get together with the New Jersey Patriots and coordinate ways in which to control Staten Island's loyalist population. He suggested confiscating the livestock from the island so that it doesn't fall into British hands. He suggested disarming the Staten Islanders and giving those weapons to Continental units that did not have weapons. And his last suggestion was quite radical for the time period, maybe even for today. He suggested that the Continental Army round up all the children of Staten Island and take them as hostages and hold them as hostages for the good political behavior of their parents. Now, the Continental Army didn't, and the Congress did not carry out that suggestion, but it is an interesting suggestion for the 18th century.
The drastic measures the Continental Army considered employing reinforced the notion that Staten Island was viewed as strategically significant, but wildly unpredictable, and at times rogue. With the British Army quickly approaching the shores of New York, the area was anxiously awaiting the impending invasion. While Washington and Lee were bracing for an attack, the residents of Staten Island held a slightly different view on the events about to unfold.
Staten Islanders welcomed the British forces onto the island. In late June, the British Navy showed up in New York Harbor. At first, General Howe was going to land his troops in Gravesend on Long Island. But at the last minute, he changed the strategy and decided to land his troops on Staten Island. And that was on the suggestion of one of his staff officers, General James Robertson, who during the French and Indian War had set up a staging area for British forces here on the island. So he knew the island's topography, he knew the residents of Staten Island, he knew the community, and he knew the strategic importance of the island. Howe takes the suggestion from Robertson, decides to land his troops here on Staten Island, and the landing begins June 28th. By the time of the Declaration of Independence, the British forces, about 9,000 strong, are on the island.
Staten Island's attitude towards the arrival of the British meant Howe faced little to no resistance while offloading his supplies and troops. And for Staten Island, the British had given them what they'd always wanted: peace and stability.
And the Staten Islanders rejoiced. The Staten Islanders saw them as their liberators, because just prior to the landing of the British, New Jersey Patriot militia were stationed on the island. The Staten Islanders saw them as not being too gentle in their sort of relationship with the residents. So Staten Islanders almost saw like the Patriots as being occupiers. And when the British land on Staten Island, they're seen as the liberators. So Staten Islanders rejoiced at the British landing. And there is one moment where Staten Islanders burned in effigy leaders of the Patriot movement, effigies of Washington, effigies of General Charles Lee. They also burned Continental script, which they were paid by Continental troops and militia. There was this great euphoria when the British landed on the island. Any Whig sympathizers, a small number of Whig sympathizers, began to leave the island and go to Elizabethtown in New Jersey. Once the British secured the island, loyalists from the surrounding area began to migrate to Staten Island.
Along with the many white loyalist refugees that fled to Staten Island, in an effort to destabilize the Patriots' social structure and economy, Lord Dunmore, then governor of Virginia, issued a proclamation, Dunmore's Proclamation, which would make Staten Island a refuge for both free and enslaved African Americans seeking freedom.
November of 1775, Lord Dunmore issued a proclamation in Virginia stating that any slave or indentured servant whose master supported the Patriot movement and escaped from their circumstances and joined the British military to help put down the rebellion would be guaranteed their freedom.
What we see is early on in the war, the British really take the lead in offering freedom to the African American slaves. Now the problem with that, of course, is that it was completely an expedient. It was not based on any kind of concern for the freedom of these slaves. It was merely a ploy to disrupt the plantations and the economy of white rebel Southerners and to gain a labor force and perhaps a fighting force of American blacks for the British.
Dunmore also recruited, based upon his proclamation, recruited his own African-American regiment called the Ethiopian Regiment, which initially was utilized in Virginia on military operations in Virginia.
It's believed that there was still a core of about 800 blacks who arrived on Staten Island from Virginia and participated in the Battle of Brooklyn as part of the British and Hessian force.
One of the most prominent black loyalists during the American Revolutionary War was Titus Cornelius, better known as Colonel Ty.
Colonel Ty, his name was Titus, and he changed his name to Ty. His rank was colonel, and that was a ceremonial rank that the British had given him because of his heroism during the Battle of Monmouth in June of 1778. He was a slave in Shrewsbury, New Jersey, in Monmouth County, and his master was a Patriot supporter. When the British land on Staten Island, Colonel Ty and others come to the island, join the British military forces, and Ty led his own sort of partisan group from Staten Island, and he would raid into New Jersey, into Monmouth County, bring back supplies, bring back prisoners, also information, intelligence for the British military to use here in the island.
As the war progresses, the island would become a nerve center for British activity in the Northeast, with refugees, loyalist supporters, and the British military working side by side to maintain the colony's status quo. As the British were completing their landing on Staten Island, a day we now know as Independence Day occurred. On July 4th, 1776, the 13 colonies declared their independence from British rule with the ratification of the Declaration of Independence. With the publication of this historic document causing patriot riots and celebration across New York City, General Howe, inside his Staten Island headquarters of the Rose and Crown Tavern, read the declaration to his officers, ending with the words, "They are certainly determined." The decision to land on Staten Island worked favorably for Howe, not only for the warm welcome, but for the island's strategic significance in Britain's overall military strategy.
Clearly, the British had been forced out of Boston during this 11-month siege following Lexington and Concord. They couldn't penetrate the interior of the continent from that narrow peninsula in Boston. And so when they came to New York, they were determined to not only seize the city, but control the entire length of the Hudson River and split the colonies in two. That was their plan for subduing the rebellion. And so when they arrived in New York, Staten Island presented a wonderful base for them. It was a heavily wooded island, and they were going to spend the summer building landing craft, much like you can imagine the Higgins boats of World War II and D-Day. These were 18th century wooden versions of those landing craft with hinged bows that could deposit not only men, but horses and artillery onto a beach. And so they had the materials there on Staten Island, and it presented a kind of self-contained, because it was completely an island, not a peninsula, it was a self-contained, defensible base camp.
Early on, the relationship between Staten Island and the British military was mutually beneficial. The residents of Staten Island had been liberated from Patriot oppression, and the British could prepare their forces for the New York campaign within Allied territory.
When the British first land on Staten Island, the local residents gained several benefits, especially financial benefits. The British were willing to pay in specie, in coin, gold and silver specie, unlike the Patriot forces that would pay in paper script or IOUs. And the Staten Islanders remembered when the British were here during the French and Indian War in the staging area, and they paid market value and sometimes above market value for their produce. So financially, there is this benefit. There's also, as far as security, there's a benefit. Staten Islanders feel secure with the British military here in their community. They feel safe from Patriot intimidation. Security, not only just for themselves, their personal security, but for their property as well.
The 3,000 residents of the island gladly welcomed Howe and his 10,000 troops. But this was just the beginning of the British invasion on Staten Island. As the islanders began their new life under British rule, Howe was preparing his army, waiting for a familiar face to deliver the final blow to Washington and the Patriot forces.
So during the Battle of Long Island, on August 27, 1776, Staten Island did play a major role. The British had spent several weeks building up their strength, waiting for Hessian auxiliaries to arrive from Europe. General William Howe was waiting for his brother, Lord Admiral Richard Howe, who arrived on July 12th. And so this entire time, the Americans were trying to prepare, trying to guess where the British would attack. Would it be in New Jersey? Would it be directly against New York City on Manhattan? Or would it be in Brooklyn? The island tactically gave the British a number of options which forced the Americans to keep guessing and more importantly, forced them to dilute and to distribute their forces, straddling two rivers, the Hudson and the East River, and significantly weakening the response that they would be able to deliver in any of those places. And of course, crucially, Staten Island served as the base, as the British amassed the largest expeditionary force in their history at that time. Some 24,000 ground troops, about 10,000 sailors, manning 30 major warships and a flotilla that numbered around 430 vessels.
Washington's decision not to fortify the Narrows ultimately proved fatal for the Continental Army during the New York campaign. From this spot, on August 22, 1776, Howe began his invasion of Long Island, transporting 4,000 British troops from Staten Island across the Narrows to the shores of Gravesend Bay. By August 23rd, just 24 hours after the initial landing, the British had transported 20,000 troops, outnumbering the Continental Army 2-1. Sitting atop Staten Island, overlooking the Narrows, was Flagstaff Fort. Originally built by the Continental Army in 1776, the British captured the fort during their invasion of the island. While the original fort was destroyed in 1806, Battery Weed, completed in 1861, now sits defending the Narrows. Flagstaff Fort would have served as a commanding presence for the British, having a full bird's-eye view of the 20,000 troops crossing the Narrows into battle. Strategically, Staten Island was the optimal location for Howe and the British forces to call home. Washington and Lee's decision not to defend Staten Island against the British landing in retrospect seems questionable, but did Washington consider the island's importance once the British were here?
There's I think a little noted paper in George Washington's correspondence, which shows that he actually hoped to disrupt the British force before it had reached full strength. There's a record of a meeting, a council of war, in which Washington proposed to his generals that they launch an attack on Staten Island. And it shows you that, for one thing, Washington was extremely aggressive. This fits a pattern that he exhibited in his early military career and during the siege of Boston as well. And here in New York, he hoped to disrupt the British when they only had about 10,000 men on the island. And looking back, it's tantalizing to ask what would have happened if he had been able to carry out that plan, to attack Staten Island from about 6 different directions. When we look back in retrospect, it seems a daring and perhaps foolhardy, risky plan. On the other hand, when we see how the campaign unfolded in New York, it seems to be really perhaps the most realistic and the only option that Washington had for dealing with such an overwhelming military power that he confronted, was to disrupt them before they had reached full strength. So in many ways, Staten Island played a key strategic role in the Battle of Long Island, both in the potential scenarios and in the actual event. After the American defeat in the Battle of Long Island on August 27th, the British waited about 2 weeks to push their advantage and to land on Manhattan. And it was during that interval, on September 11th, 1776, that a peace conference was held at the Billop House at the southern end of Staten Island.
Christopher Billop was the leading loyalist on Staten Island. He was a major political figure on the island, the largest landowner on Staten Island. He was also a member of the New York Assembly, representing Staten Island, along with his son-in-law, Benjamin Seaman, a prominent local figure.
And this conference was initiated by the British, by Admiral Lord Richard Howe, and he had called the Americans into the conference in the hope of offering them peace terms, of offering pardon for their rebellion and bringing them back into the royal fold. Congress sent 3 representatives, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and Edward Rutledge. The expectations in the conference were primarily on the British side, the hopes of reconciliation. There's an interesting backstory to the Howe brothers, who had come to New York as co-commanders-in-chief, General William Howe and Admiral Richard Howe. Turns out they had a 3rd brother, an older brother named George Howe, who had been killed in America leading Massachusetts troops during the French and Indian War, when of course the British and the Americans were on the same side. And he was so beloved by his Massachusetts troops that the Massachusetts government funded a marble monument to him in Westminster Abbey, the highest possible honor. And so the Howe brothers, the 2 surviving Howe brothers, really felt a kind of undying bond of friendship for the Americans. And they had sworn that they would never fight in the American war against their countrymen. But the king had a close relationship with them, prevailed on them to come and lead the war effort in America. And so they had requested to be empowered not only as commanders, but also as peace commissioners. And so they had dual titles, and they were given the authority to confer forgiveness, to confer pardons on the Americans, and try to bring the war to a negotiated settlement. And so, oddly, these commanders-in-chief came really with the sword in one hand and the olive branch in the other. So it seems clear that they came here with this massive military force in the hope that they would be able to cow the Americans into submission, that perhaps after the defeat on Long Island, the Americans would see the error of their ways, the futility of carrying on the fight, and that the war would be brought to a conclusion without further bloodshed. Now, unfortunately for General William Howe and Lord Richard Howe, the Americans were really not interested in negotiating. They had just declared their independence, and they had to show their allies, the French and the Dutch, that they were serious, that they were not going to go back on that commitment to independence, and that bankrolling them and supporting them would not result in a clash with the British in which the Americans were going to scurry back to the apron strings of the mother country. And so the Americans held firm, and at the conference, there were some very memorable lines. Lord Howe said that if Americans were to fail to lose the war. It would give him such mortification as if it were a fallen brother. Clearly a reference also to his slain brother George. And he was explicit about the warm feelings that he held for the Americans. And Franklin apparently responded with great aplomb, "Well, my dear Lord, we shall do our utmost to prevent you that calamity." It was clear that the Americans were not there to negotiate away their independence. And though they had a pleasant meal together in a nicely prepared and decorated room, ultimately the negotiations came to naught, and the Americans were allowed to go free.
The failure to find peace on the island they called home would become a dark reminder for the residents of Staten Island. And as the natural effects of the war play out, the fate of Staten Island becomes ever more clouded. The landing of the British in 1776 began a new era for Staten Islanders, one with perceived stability and longevity. But as this ugly and brutal war dragged on, the once liberators of this small island became their captors. The warm welcome that Staten Island had displayed to the British in 1776 would become a harsh reality for the residents of Staten Island, who would come to question their safety, security, and ultimate decision to remain loyal to the crown. A dream of liberation had now become a caged nightmare.
As the war progressed, Loyalist sympathies on Staten Island deteriorated considerably. And of course, after a 7-year occupation, the ravages of war are bound to break down people's enthusiasm for an occupying army.
As the war moves on, many British soldiers begin to realize that they might not be winning. They begin to take out their frustrations on the locals. You know, there's a sense of, well, if you held the Patriots in check, we wouldn't have to be here. And so there is this sort of frustration that builds up among British troops here on Staten Island. And they begin to take out that frustration on the local residents, on their property and on their persons.
If you are a population of 3,000 people on an island, and you have an occupying army which at its peak reached perhaps 30,000 between the British troops and the Hessians and the British sailors. The British made tremendous demands on the population for food, for labor.
The sense of security begins to break down. There's more and more raids coming over from New Jersey, from Patriot strongholds in New Jersey. The amount of irregular warfare begins to increase. Staten Islanders are almost caught in this sort of no man's land. Staten Island residents are caught in the middle between the British military and their loyalist supporters and patriots in New Jersey and their sort of partisans. It becomes almost like a civil war here, where it's neighbor against neighbor, brother against brother, and there's the sort of rules of war almost, are ignored in many cases.
Of course, there was violence by soldiers, capital crimes that were committed against civilians that basically went unpunished. They were taken before courts martial, but soldiers were usually let off scot-free. I think that the attitude toward the British became more and more pessimistic as the war went on.
The effects of the war not only altered the attitudes of the islanders, but had dramatic consequences on the island's physical landscape.
Now, we know from George Washington's accounts that when he came back to the city toward the end of the war, he observed that there was nothing taller than a shrub growing on Manhattan. And I think we can assume something similar in Staten Island, where the British had cut down so many trees, not only for firewood during the winters, but to build wooden landing craft for their amphibious invasions. We can imagine an island that was denuded of trees and where British wagons and troops had tramped the fields and the roads, where houses had been broken into and used as quarters for troops, Churches that were not churches of England were probably used for stables, and mansions, of course, were taken over by generals, and maybe they would have suffered the least damage. But all in all, an army of 30,000 men, 10 times the native population of Staten Island, would have had a tremendous impact on the physical environment, and not a good one.
Many of the thick woodlands were deforested by the British military. At the beginning of the occupation, the British military would pay you for your use of your woodland areas. But by the end of the war, the British were just seizing the woodland properties and just cutting down trees to use for their military forces. So by the end of the war, Staten Island was pretty much deforested. Personal psychology of the Staten Islanders had changed. I mean, the Staten Islanders had faced this occupation for 7.5 years, had felt the brunt of physical violence against them, psychological manipulation. It was not just the landscape that had changed, but also Staten Islanders had changed. And by the end of the war, those Staten Islanders who had welcomed the British as liberators welcomed the evacuation of the British from Staten Island and rejoiced as the British sailed out of the Narrows into the Atlantic.